going to get started. Wow, is that loud? I feel like I'm extremely loud. No? Okay. It just sounds really weird hearing yourself talk. My name is Sheldon Kroning. I'm the IRIS Quality Lead at the Department of Health Services, and today we're going to talk about developing a meaningful ISSP support plan in the IRIS program. I tend to speak fast sometimes, so if I am, just tell me to slow down, and I'll either slow down or we can revisit what we were talking about. So there's two handouts that I gave you. One is the copy of the PowerPoint, just to give you an opportunity to take some notes. And then the other one are the actual work instructions that are published in the IRIS policy manual for the work instructions. I think one key to know about the work instructions, what they are is they're kind of the do's and don'ts regarding the policies and the procedures that the IRIS program has. And then it also gives you, on the far left column, you'll see on the second and third page, you'll see the actual steps. And that steps identifies who is responsible for what portion of that task. Could be the IRIS participant, could be the IRIS consultant, could be the guardian, could be the fiscal employer agent. So just going to give you an idea. Again, for all of our policies and procedures, we have the same type of work instructions in our manual. There's on the top left, you can see the publication number. So if you ever wanted to revisit that, you can go to the IRIS website. You can search for that document, and then you can find our whole manual that has all of the work instructions for all the different policies for the IRIS program. So just real quick before I get started, I kind of want us to get an idea of who my audience is. So can you tell me, do I have any IRIS consultants? I think I do, but all right, that's good. That's a good start. And what about IRIS participants? Okay, good. So the first question is, for the most part, you guys know what an individual, just by knowing my audience, there's obviously heavily IRIS consultants, which I'm really happy about because this is for you. This is to help you develop these plans when you're meeting with individuals in their homes. So as we know, what is the ISSP? The ISSP is really a piece of paper. I mean, it's just a document. It's what the content that goes inside the ISSP, that's where the meaningful piece comes in. That's where the meat and potatoes of someone's plan, that's where it happens at. So the ISSP, it identifies the person's long-term care outcomes, the supports and services, and then the provider information who's providing those supports and services. What is long-term care? Interestingly enough, I've had conversations with individuals here while at the conference, and I just asked this question to a few people just in conversation, and I got a wide variety of answers. A lot of it was about services, a lot of it was about supports, but really it's care that we are able to provide for individuals who would require a nursing home or maybe an institution level of care to have those same supports and services right in the community, right in their own home. So to have that agency, or just to not have to be inside of an institution or have to be at a nursing home, you get those same supports and services right in your home. And I think that's the really cool thing, that I think we all have that same vision and we have that same belief. So examples of what long-term care is, could be pre-voc, could be day services, respite, transportation, and supportive home care. Just a few examples of what those types of services are. On the bottom here, obviously you have the copy as well, but the IRIS service definition manual is there. There's a publication as well. That's all the different supports and services that the IRIS program allows an individual to have on that plan. You can find all of those services on that publication as well. It gives you a good definition of what that supported service is. It also gives you the information on what type of provider can provide that service and kind of some requirements or some licensing or credentialing depending on what type of provider is providing that service. But all that information is housed in the service definition manual. So what is a long-term care outcome? Can anyone give me an example of what a long-term care outcome may be? I'll pick you if you don't raise your hand. Anyone? Can someone help me? Yeah.
Wouldn't it be like what you want to accomplish with the supports and services that you're getting?
Perfect. Yeah. So did everyone hear what she said?
Can you say it again?
Can you say it again?
What you want, it's like your goal, what you want to accomplish with the supports and services that you're getting, or that are on your plan.
Yep. So the long-term care is exactly what you said. It's the desired result that you get of having supports, services, or goods on your plan. It's what you want to accomplish at the end of your plan. Whatever that outcome is, that's what that long-term care outcome would be, the end, the result. This allows individuals to remain living in a community setting of their choice. I think that's a really important word that we talk about, the plans and the goals and the programs that we have is choice. We hear that word quite frequent. It promotes community integrated employment, which I think employment initiatives are extremely important in the populations that we serve, as well as community inclusion, having access to their community. One of the examples I use or talk about is that community inclusion is not purchasing or using your IRIS budget to purchase Green Bay Packer tickets. Although as a Bears fan, I don't know why you'd want to purchase Green Bay Packer tickets, but hey, but nonetheless, it's not the purpose of it. But the purpose of it would be is community inclusion is if that's one of the things that you want to do and do with your friends or your family, we want to make sure that you have the supports and services in place to be able to do those things, whether it's transportation, whether it's personal cares or some type of caregiving that has to happen while you're at the game. That's what we talk about when we mean community inclusion. So the next part about it, so once you've established we've talked about what long-term care is, talked about, well, what is a long-term care outcome? The next question is the strategy. The strategy is the how. This is the how are you going to accomplish that outcome. Some examples of some strategies may include hiring an individual. So let's say you have a supportive home care need. Hiring an individual, a person to help you with some supportive home care tasks. You may utilize your church's van to provide that transportation to and from church. Using an agency provider to provide respite care. I actually just had that conversation with someone today regarding that. And then using an agency provider to provide supported employment. Those are just some examples on how that you're going to accomplish whatever that long-term care outcome is. We had one time, a long time ago, we had a long-term care outcome at the department. We did some reviewing of some outcomes. And one of the outcomes that we actually seen on someone's plan was, I like red dresses. And I thought, how is that where's the long-term care outcome in I like red dresses? So had conversation with the consultant and we kind of went back and forth. And what we found out is that it wasn't about red dresses specifically, but it was about this individual wanted her independence. She wanted to be able to purchase her own things and gain that independence. So how would you do that in what we were just talking about? Community integrated employment. That person increased their support or their job coaching hours, which ultimately increased the hours that they were able to work. And now they were able to purchase those things, much like that red dress that she was talking about. So that's one of the things when we talk about those outcomes and these types of services. So once you've decided, okay, what you need, now the question is, how am I going to get that? What is my approach? There's different types of approaches you may take. These include the one that we always hear quite often, natural supports. Someone has to be willing and qualified to be that natural support, first of all, to define that. The next one would be, is this a service that I need, and can it be accomplished through the use of my card services, whether it's Medicaid or Medicare? Going back to the community services, if going to church is a plan, something that you want to, part of your community inclusion is attending your local church, but you can't get there and you can't provide that outcome or can't accomplish that outcome, maybe using your community services such as your church or a community center to help you accomplish that goal. Not last, but least, maybe the IRIS-funded services, the services that we have that we would allow you to use your budget for to purchase those services. But as we know, IRIS-funded services are what? Can anyone tell me? What was that? The funding source of last resort, meaning you must have already talked about these. You've had these discussions. Again, specifically for the consultants, these are the questions that you're going through at the kitchen table when you're talking to individuals. Sometimes these conversations can be difficult, but that's what we want you to do. Those are some of your responsibilities. But talking about natural supports, is that a possibility? You know, instead of using my IRIS budget to pay someone to do something for me, is it something that my neighbor, maybe they would just come over and snow blow my driveway when they did theirs? You know, not saying that they have to, but that's just conversations that we talk about. And sometimes I think we miss them because we always think there has to be this paid person involved to do that. And that's not necessarily what happens. I think some of those natural supports, we all have those every day of our life. We just don't call them natural supports. Again, when it's determined that you've exhausted all of other avenues and now it's time to talk about the IRIS waiver services, that's where the consultant will speak with the participant. They have that service definition manual. They can pull that manual out and see what services can I use in this manual that are going to help me accomplish this long-term care outcome. Well, that wasn't good, was it? Oh, here we go. So again, once we get to the IRIS funded services, I feel like there's heat coming out of this ceiling somewhere up here. Maybe you guys are just making me nervous. So when we talk about the IRIS services, we talk about the type, we talk about the amount, we talk about the cost, and we talk about the provider. These are those things, that the conversations that you have once you've identified, I need to use my IRIS budget to fund specific supports or services to meet that outcome. These are the next things you have to talk about. And it's not that we don't want services to drive the outcome. So when you're sitting there and the participant knows what their IRIS budget is, it's not about how many hours fit in my budget. You should have already had an outcome of whatever that outcome is. Then you've determined I need someone to do it for me. And now I've determined it's IRIS funded services I need, like supportive home care or respite. And that's when we get into the discussion of, well, how much do you need? You know, how many hours do you actually need to meet that outcome? What's a good rate? I mean, we talk about usual and customary rate, and I know those conversations, you know, we could probably have a whole conference on just that topic, but that's some of the questions that you guys have to have at the kitchen table when we're developing the ISSP for that individual. Prioritizing the supports and services. And we'll get to some questions. I kind of want to have some discussion regarding the PowerPoint in itself and the topic of building a plan itself. So it seems like we kind of ran through this quick, but once a person has developed the plan, they have the outcomes, they have the supports and services they need, and now we need to apply that to that person's budget. Again, a conversation that sometimes it's difficult, but what we want to know is that we talk about the 6 domains of self-direction. Can anyone tell me what the 6 domains of self-direction specifically to the IRIS program are?
Health and safety, transportation, community employment, relationships, having a place of one's own. Employment.
Yep. So I'll rattle them off for you because it's something I've read a few times over the last few months. But the first one is allowing or having an individual have the ability to maintain or obtain a place of their own choice, meaning where they live at. It's probably the most important thing, and if we think about our life, that's something that we had to do as well, determine where we're going to live. The next one would be community integrated employment. We talked about, you know, we've had those big initiatives regarding employment in our world, and we want to see the individuals who are able to work. We want that to happen. So the second one, community integrated employment. We want to promote that. The third one would be where we talked about community inclusion, not purchasing Packer tickets, but community inclusion, having access to your community. And I look at those kind of over here on my right side, those 3. Those are those 3 main places that we're talking about when we're talking about an outcome. And really, if you have an outcome, those are the only 3 places that can happen. It's either at your home, it's at your work, or it's in your community, wherever you're at. The other 3 that you mentioned, access to transportation. So if we think about having your own home, having your own job, having community inclusion, well, typically sometimes there's some form of transportation that may be needed to obtain that goal. The second one would be building positive relationships. We need to make sure that when we're helping participants develop long-term care outcomes, we've identified all those things, and now we're talking about the building positive relationships. It's part of the responsibility of the consultant to make sure that that relationship is a positive relationship with that individual, if it's a caretaker or, you know, et cetera. Health and safety, probably the most important thing we talk about all the time. And there's really not a goal, and I've talked to consultants, and we've had these conversations, and there's really not a goal specific to health and safety. It's really all those other things, and we should always be assessing health and safety regardless of what the outcome is, whether it's, you know, to maintain your own home, to have a job, to have that community access. It doesn't matter. Health and safety should be the #1 important thing. So now that we've done that, and you're with your consultant, or as the consultant, you're developing that plan, and now it's on to the budget piece. How do I apply my budget to all of my long-term care outcomes? And the first thing that you should be doing is so now we have all of these outcomes here, and again, I don't want to make it seem like one outcome is more important than the other outcome, but it's really hard to have any to talk about community inclusion and having this employment goal when I don't even have a place that's healthy and safe and it's my own choice of my own home. So when we talk about applying the IRIS budget, the first thing we would do is you would take all of the long-term care outcomes that are directed or part of the I want my own home and I want to be healthy and safe at my own home. You apply the budget to those long-term care outcomes. The next step you would do is you then would apply all of your outcomes related to community integrated employment to that budget. Now, not everyone has a community employment goal, so if there's not one, then obviously we don't have to make up one. You move back to the next phase. And the next phase, not that it's the least important, but again, I think living arrangement is probably the most important. Finally, you take your budget and you apply it to all of your goals related to community inclusion. At the end of the budget, or at the end of applying all of your outcomes, what happens if your budget is out? It's, oh man, my budget's not going to fit. It's not going to work. It's not going to be able to sustain the long-term care outcomes that I have. Well, we have that nifty process in the IRIS program, the budget amendment process. So if there's a long-term care outcome that is related to an outcome that you don't have the funds for as the participant, and again, I feel like I'm speaking a lot of this stuff that you guys have heard before, but that's the conversation that we have. When we apply that, we submit the budget amendments regarding the outcomes that did not fit in those, regarding that first budget estimate. It's the starting point we always talk about. And that's how we do that. And then the department will make a decision based on, all of the rules and policies, whether that budget amendment will be approved or not. So that's really, in a nutshell, how to develop the plan. The goal is that, this is one of our smaller policies, but the goal is that this wasn't to be prescriptive and to sit down and read this to the participant and say, this is how we do the plan. This is to give the IRIS consultant some guidelines, some tips, just some structure on how the plan should be built so that you're not having the discussion of the Green Bay Packer tickets or the things that really aren't allowable regarding your long-term care outcome. That's what this thing was designed for, but it was also designed for participants to have an understanding when you're sitting having that conversation and they say, well, what are you talking about? What is this long-term care outcome? That's not, what is that? You have a reference now. You have something that you can sit down and pull this handy little sheet out and say, here's what we're talking about when we're developing your plan. I think we flew through that. I feel like I went through that very quick, but I told them that it wouldn't be an hour and a half because I don't want to be prescriptive. I'm not telling you how to write a plan. This isn't to force you to write a plan a certain way. It's just to give you the structure and the guideline to have those conversations to develop that plan. Any specific questions regarding the plan development piece? Come on, you guys got to give me something. Yes, there we go. What's that?
My Uncle John's my guardian.
Your Uncle John's your guardian? Okay.
Yes.
So he may help you develop your plan. Yes.
How often can you change it?
Change what?
The outcome?
Yes, of course. And that's the thing. That your ISSP, as we always call it, it's a living, breathing document. This thing is ongoing. So if all of a sudden something changes in your life where your outcome now has changed, where I didn't want to work or now I want to work, you can always change your outcomes. Obviously working with your consultant to get that outcomes, to get your plan updated, to get those outcomes established, but then also knowing now you got to go back to that process of identifying the provider, right? How am I going to accomplish that outcome? But yes, nonetheless, I think we all know that you can change that plan whenever you like to regarding your outcomes.
Not just at the year time.
Not just at the year time, no. Anytime that you have, for participants, anytime that you have, you wake up in the morning and you're like, hey, you know what, I want to change an outcome and this is what I want. You reach out to your consultant, they should be able to help you, establish that change in that plan. So it's just not an annual thing where you get to change your outcomes, no. Had a question in the front here?
I was going to ask, so you went over those 6 areas where I wanted to make sure I got them right. Those are the 6 areas of self.
6 domains of self-direction?
Okay. And then I was just wondering, you did go through that area a bit quickly.
Yep.
So I'm trying to understand how long-term outcomes and the domains of self-direction, how those interact.
Yep. So we have those outcomes that we talked, or the 6 domains. And so what we're saying in the IRIS program, that your outcome, your long-term care outcome, must be specific to those. First of all, I kind of had those 3 different categories. You had maintaining your own home, or establishing your own home, community integrated employment, and then community inclusion. Those are like those 3 settings. The 6 domains, which are 3 of those, your long-term care outcome must be essentially directed by one of those. So that, yep.
So when you're writing a plan on a person's plan, can they have multiple long-term outcomes under a given domain?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And do they have to have an outcome under each domain?
And that answer to that is no. You do not have to have a domain specific to, again, we had talked about this before, is that there's not really a goal that's specific to health and safety. You know, there's not a long-term care outcome that's only health and safety driven. Typically it's, I want to be healthy and safe in my home, I want to be healthy and safe at my job, or I want to be healthy and safe while I'm in the community. So that's kind of something that we just assess no matter what. But that is one of the domains. Yep. Back here.
The way that you described the priority of
Yes.
the outcomes, would you foresee that having any impact if we need to pursue a VA for an IRIS member? That if their request for a VA is one of those lower prioritized outcomes, that maybe it wouldn't be as likely to be approved?
I don't think that's any bearing on whether we approve it or not. What that is that, and part of the reason for this change was that if someone's asking for a budget amendment for supportive home care, let's just use that as an example, because it's so important to have supportive home care, to have a worker in their home, for whatever the reasons are, and that's like the number one goal. But yet I look on the plan, and there's a bunch of things on the plan regarding community inclusion and things of that nature. My concern would be, well, how can we even establish these long-term care outcomes regarding community inclusion if you don't even have a safe place at home? You know, you haven't even established those long-term care outcomes. And so, no, I don't think it's not going to prohibit or have any impact on that person's plan, as long as it meets the criteria regarding the budget amendment. Is the outcome, is the service, you know, is it allowable service? Does the outcome make sense for that individual? I mean, so no, the answer to that question would be no. She'd be proud of me, the lady at a keynote. I said no, and I stood by.
Well, when you're looking at the three, I don't want to say lesser, but the other three than the ones that are on the screen, you can fit them into the ones that are on the screen. So you're addressing them, it's just, you're addressing them in the three that are kind of prioritized in a way, because
And that's exactly right.
from your home, you'll be able to get to and from work.
Right.
Your relationships are part of the community inclusion, because that's how you're building your relationships. So it's
And that's exactly, you're exactly right on the money there. And that's what you talked about earlier. Over here you have those three kind of areas, those places, you know, home, community, job over here. But the whole time that you're working with that individual to establish that long-term care outcome, these other three things you should be assessing. Again, assessing the need. Does that individual need transportation to meet this outcome? Building positive relationships. Is this going to promote building positive relationships for that individual? And then finally, again, that number one most important thing, is this long-term care outcome, is it a healthy and safe long-term care outcome? And then looking at all the supports, the services, you know, we talked about the strategy and the approach. Health and safety should always be something that's at the forefront, that we're always asking ourselves, is this healthy and safe? Is this going to promote healthy and safe for that individual? So you're right on the money. Those other three can be assessed in every single one of those, the first three that we discussed. Yes.
When individuals receiving supports budgeted through IRIS are up for annual review, if some of their services are contracted out to like a nonprofit organization, like for the case of where I work, some of our reimbursements come through IRIS, and then we provide the services to the consumers. If we have a plan as sort of the middleman person, if we have a plan that we're updating, can that also go with that person to their IRIS annual review, and will that be taken into consideration?
So can you tell me where you work or what you do?
Yes, I work at New Horizons in Ashland, and I provide direct services, and I'm also a supervisor for my department.
And so to what you're asking that, so it sounds like you guys have also developed a plan for the individual?
Yes,
and
we
what
call them living support plans.
Yep. So what I'll say to you for the IRIS program regarding that, I don't necessarily think that plan that you're talking about would be something that would be addressed with the consultant as far as their plan. But how that would play in effect is that person should have already had an outcome, because you as being a service provider, the person identified already an outcome. And I don't know what the outcome was, but for somehow, some way, they got to the conclusion that New Horizon was the provider that they were going to need to provide whatever that support or that service was for that individual. So if that kind of makes...
I guess I'm meaning because the nature of providing direct services, we have so much face-to-face time with the consumers. We know them really well. I mean, as good friends even.
Right.
And so if our organization's service plan it seems like it would be valuable to help IRIS consultants.
No, I think it's, no, right. So I don't want to take away and say that it's not valuable or that it can attend there. I mean, I think that would be something that you'd be given to the IRIS consultant to say, hey, you know, even part of this outcome, this service, we've also done this work too. This probably is something that you want to continue to discuss at that annual planning meeting. But overall, like I said, the goal for that individual, that long-term care outcome, somehow, some way, that agency that you work for, they were and that was a person's choice of provider to provide whatever that service is to meet whatever that outcome is. So do you provide like a supportive home care? Is that kind of what?
Supportive home care, personal care,
Yep.
employment.
And so if I think about the supportive home care aspect, that person must have had a goal that they needed someone to help them maintain in one of those areas we talked about. And let's say it was I needed them to maybe do some laundry, you know, straighten up my house, provide some supportive home care tasks. When they got to the determination of who or how am I going to get this accomplished, they decided, oh, I'm going to use an agency provider and I'm going to use New Horizon. And so that's how they've already met that goal that we're talking about. But if you have another internal goal that while they're there, they're working on some other things, yeah, I think that's extremely important. I think it's extremely important that the consultant is aware and has access, and maybe even that plan that you're talking about is actually uploaded into their Wizards, in the Wizards system. Chris is in the back somewhere, or did he leave me? He left me. So yeah, that would be something that you'd want to give to them so that they could upload into Wizards, and that would have access to that. Because in the event that that person leaves and goes to some other agency, guess what? We keep that record whole, and now that they still have that documentation where we don't have to figure out what they were working on already. It's already there.
Right.
Yes.
I have a question.
You guys are real quiet over here.
Outcomes regarding, I guess, does it matter specifically which domain you put the outcome under? For instance, you have health and safety.
Yep.
And if I had somebody, you know, to be safe, they wanted to have SDPC services through IRIS, right? That would help with the person's health and safety, personal care.
Okay.
So I would think that would be under health and safety, but it sounded like before you said not to use health and safety.
Right. So, right. So clearly we have a Wizards user here, right? Correct? Yes. And so we know that there's, in the way the Wizards system is set up right now, you can actually pick every one of those domains and put things underneath that. There's things that Chris and I are working out that we've had discussions that I don't specifically think that you should have a domain or a long-term care outcome that's just health and safety, because I think if you look at what that is, you could figure it out, you could put it in one of these other three places that you're talking about. I'm not saying to go in and update all your plans and change everything today if it's all just under health and safety. I'm saying as you develop that plan and you're making those plan changes, I would target those goals and to put them under each one of those areas that we were talking about. And then establish the health and safety, you know, obviously you're assessing health and safety as you're establishing that long-term care outcome and services anyways. So you don't have to have one under just health and safety, and I'm not telling you not to use it. I'm saying from a program perspective, if we have a long-term care outcome that's related to, you know, yeah, I want to be healthy and safe in my home, then that's fine, but let's talk about, that's about the long-term care outcome of maintaining my own my own home, and then everything else would go underneath that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
In the back?
So in past years, there used to be a huge drive to make those outcomes in the IRIS members' own words. Back off from that a little bit and just try to re-paraphrase it to more accurately describe.
Yeah, I don't think, you know, and we had these discussions too where, you know, we don't want to lose the participant's voice, you know, when we're talking about the outcomes and, you know, what's on paper. But I don't think that we lose the participant's voice by not using the specific words that the person is using. I think if I were to go back and look at someone's annual planning meeting case note, I should be able to take out from there what the participant was talking about when we had that discussion. And I can go back to the red dress topic that we were talking about. I'm sure in that case note it talked about, you know, talk to the participant, we were talking about outcomes, this red dress conversation came up, but to me it stopped and it should have just kept going a little further, because it's the role of the consultant to figure out what are we trying to accomplish here, and to help the participant figure out what are my long-term care outcomes and how do they fit within the ISSP development thing that we're talking about. So I don't necessarily think we're moving away totally from that, but it's just not documented. I think it was Enterprise, I think was the name of the system from years ago, that, you know, I think it had the participants' actual words, and then it also had that's something else that Chris and I talked about too, just having it in Wizards to say, maybe I have a long-term care outcome, and maybe I keep it where it says I like red dresses for the participant's voice, but then underneath that we talk about this community integrated employment goal, and increasing their hours of care while they're at their job, things of that nature. But we just haven't gotten there yet. But right now, I think you can still capture the participant's voice within the conversation that you're having, and it's documented there. It's just not specifically on that plan document. Yes, sir.
I look at the staff office at Ashton up there, I'm the boss, second boss up there.
Okay.
I'm the janitor, I'm just a janitor there,
Okay.
but I'm the boss there.
So are you an IRIS participant by chance?
No.
No? But I bet you probably have a goal somewhere on your plan regarding employment, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
But I'm the second manager up there to staff office,
Okay.
janitor job. My old boss Bill left me, I took that spot.
Nice.
It's hard for me.
It's a promotion.
Yeah, it's hard for me to get the next step where I'm gonna do
Okay.
help my team.
Yep.
Set people team, help them to be a good boss to them.
That's good.
But
That's
I need
good.
some help get along the line.
Yep, the right supports and services, correct.
But I need some more help doing it.
Understandable. Any other questions? I'm going to force you guys to ask questions over here. This is so quiet.
Can you talk a little bit about the budget amendment process?
Ooh. I don't think that's on the agenda. I got to look at the agenda and ask that. Sure, I can answer a question. Sure.
I mean, just
Oh,
just
you mean-
what is it like?
What is it like? Whoa, that's a loaded question.
Into IRIS, and I mean, that you'll probably need.
Yep.
I'm just wondering.
Well, so what I will tell you is, and I'll talk about this only because I'm talking about something that's already published and out there. So the document that we were talking about with the work instructions, so if you wanted to visit and just look at the budget amendment process, it's all well documented. But essentially the budget amendment process is that when someone has this budget, this starting point of, when they're building their plan, if it's determined after I've, documented my long-term care outcome, if there's additional funding that's needed to meet those outcomes, your consultant is responsible or will help you navigate the budget amendment process by completing all of the paperwork and then sending all of that to the department, who then reviews that and then makes a determination based on that individual's needs and that budget amendment, all of the documentation, et cetera, then make a decision based on that whether to approve or deny that funding.
Is it generally a pretty lengthy process? Or?
I don't think it. I mean, I can say, and I think there's some people in the room that will agree with me. The process used to be a very unorganized process, I'll say. And we've done a lot of things to put some organization to it, just by having our SharePoint site where all the work is done in this site. There's statuses where we can communicate with the consultants when there's things that are needed or not needed. So no, I would say that the process now, and I think like agencies out here that I work with directly would say that the process is pretty quick now once you have everything in place. I mean, so sometimes people will say, oh, it's taking forever, and then we find out that, well, part of it was that the participant had a responsibility to obtain 3 bids for a new service that they're asking for, and that's the process we're waiting on. But I would say once the department receives everything in whole and everything is complete, the process is fairly quick regarding the decision makes. There's 2 individuals that work together with me day in and day out on processing these, and I think they've gotten pretty quick on them. Yes, sir.
To be honest, I'm also a guardian for an individual.
Okay.
So how much is the functional screen affects the rate?
Oh.
Is that
So this is, yeah. As we know, the budget estimate that comes is derived from the functional screen. And so how much impact, it's all of the impact. I mean, that's where, it's just the starting point. So I think sometimes people, we've had some expansions and people get stuck on this budget estimate's not going to meet my needs. It's not going to meet my needs. How do we come up with this, or why did my budget decrease? There's a lot of things that have went into account for these factors. But nonetheless, even the forum that I was just speaking in Dane County, that it's a starting point for people. If there's a long-term care outcome that someone needs and still attempting to accomplish, I think the providers here in the room here would agree with that. If the outcome is there, the departments, I mean, we're going to fund it. I mean, essentially, if it meets all of the criteria, it's not something that I don't want to put a barrier up in front and say it's all about just the dollars so that now you can't meet this outcome of employment. That's not the goal. That's not the goal of this process. The goal is to make sure that individuals have the right supports and services in place to meet those outcomes.
So we can expect our ICs to fight hard for whatever amount we need just in case.
Yeah, and I don't even want it to make it seem like the IC has to convince the department that this person needs it, because it's there, it's documented. I mean, we review the functional, when we get these reviews, we review the budget amendment, we review the functional screen, we review a lot of different documentation to come up with the need. For example, if someone says, I really need overnight care to remain healthy and safe in my home, and then I look at the functional screen, and the functional screen says the person requires no overnight care, they're independent at night, and et cetera, then I would question, well, how are you justifying the need for the outcome of overnight care if the functional screen is telling me that you don't necessarily need that? Either A, you don't need it, or the functional screen needs to be updated to actually reflect that person's need. So that's kind of how we look at we look at more than just the budget amendment. Again, the consultant has a responsibility to put a well-budget amendment document together. I mean, they have that role. But as far as I don't want to sound like they have to convince the department or sell us something or because I don't want people to think that, wow, my consultant's a poor writer and they're never going to get this approved because they didn't articulate it well enough. I mean, it's bigger than just what goes into the functional screen. Yes, ma'am.
My sister has been in the Dane County program for not quite 40 years.
Okay.
She has a well-established functional need.
Yes.
Why? What I don't understand is if after all of those years, we know what she needs, we know what, and now we're going through this with the possibility that we're going to have to go through appeals and all the rest of this stuff. Why isn't that just transferred over? It's not like it's something new.
Mm-hmm.
It's a well-established, this is what she needs
Yep.
to survive and function well.
Yep. So I worked at the Dane County. I worked for Dane County for REM, Wisconsin for several years. I was the program director and coordinator. So I get the Dane County model, and I know how well the Dane County model worked for individuals. Mm-hmm. The new programs are here. I don't want this to sound like an expansion meeting. But it's here, and I would say if there's a plan in place that's already established and you have well-established providers and the services are working well, then if the person were in the IRIS program, I don't see why that plan wouldn't continue with those same types of supports and services.
That's what I'm talking, because we have to make this determination.
Yep.
And at this point, I'm leaning toward Linda being in the IRIS program.
Okay.
Because there were issues
Yeah.
in the past that
Yep.
greatly concerned me where other people had control.
Okay.
And it's just like no one's ever been able to explain, if we have something established and it's working well, why we would have to.
And I would, yeah, and I would say from the IRIS perspective and from someone who's transferred from the Dane County model that we're not asking you to change your supports and services on your plan. I don't think that's what your consultant's going to ask you to do. The cool thing about the IRIS program is that we don't have a provider network, for example, where it's not like, well, you can't use that provider anymore because we don't contract with that provider. The IRIS program, you choose your own provider. As long as they're willing, they're qualified, and they meet the requirements, it would be the same requirements that the Dane County would have had for that same provider. They have to meet those same expectations and requirements for the IRIS program. And if that's the plan and those things are working, then I don't see why her plan wouldn't continue if she was in the IRIS program.
So I can pretty much expect that I can maintain the same.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, long-term care supports and services. We're not talking about Packer tickets, are we? No. Okay. So as long as we're talking long-term care supports and services, qualified providers, I don't see why her plan would change if in the event that she chose the IRIS program. So I don't want you to have a fear to think I'm going to lose everything that we've been working for that many of years, all because we switched programs. The goal is that we don't want individuals to have to lose the supports and services that she's currently receiving, especially if they're working and they're working well. Yeah, I mean, and Yeah, the goal would be to make those plans continue the continuity of care, to maintain that, so that there's no gap in services and that the person doesn't have to feel like I just lost everything that obviously, you guys have been working so hard to accomplish and obtain. So.
I do have one other question on others, well, two actually. One
Okay.
is the transportation.
I'll say this. If you have some specific IRIS questions, either see me after this or my contact information is there. It's my direct number, my email, obviously. Feel free to, reach out to me if you have some specific questions. I don't,
Well, I'm sure you understand what transportation.
100%. Yeah, it's a, yep, totally understand. But again, I'll just briefly, if there's a provider that she needs, she gets to choose that provider now. And again, I know it feels like you almost unraveled this braid that has been so tightly, neat and put together. But the thing is, specialized transportation, it's a service that IRIS funds. And so if there's a transportation need, then the funds should be available, whether you use the budget that you currently have, or if there's a long-term care outcome that we're saying, hey, we can't accomplish it without additional funding and we need the transportation piece, then the goal is to find a transportation provider. They're the most cost-effective, they're working, they're qualified, then that's who you'd use for your transportation provider. I was wondering if I was going to get any Dane County questions while I was standing up here. You got me. Oh. Any other questions? Yes. Say that again.
Are employment goals in a separate budget or your main budget?
So if you have a goal for integrated employment, it's no different than any of your other goals. So there's not a separate pot of funding here if you have a goal that's related to just employment. They would all come out of your IRIS budget, regardless of what the long-term care outcome would be.
So if you need a job coach 40 hours a week, you're likely going to need a VA process if you're like $50 an hour for a job coach.
Yeah, that's a whole different conversation. But yeah, I would say you need something. There would definitely be some conversation that would have to happen. Any other questions? All right. Well, I thank you guys for coming. I was going to get some claps. I stopped some people. I'm sorry. No, thanks for coming again. This is a tool. This isn't prescriptive. This isn't supposed to go back and change all of your plans regarding the domains, but just to give you some guides. So thanks for coming, and have a safe travels home.